Good evening, good evening. I am the brand new president and CEO of the Computer History Museum. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. I am thrilled to be here. And on behalf of our trustees, our staff, our volunteers, all our supporters, I just want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. We have a fantastic conversation. Our mission is to code technology, not just its past, but its present and its future. And tonight we're going to focus on how digital technology can help us preserve the past for an impact on the future. Now, many of you might know about Unicode Consortium because of emojis. Who doesn't love emojis? But their work goes way beyond that, including helping to preserve endangered languages. Simply teaching more people to speak a language isn't enough to save it. We have to preserve its digital and written future. And that's what Unicode has been working on. And tonight I'm really excited to hear from the pioneers and the experts who are ensuring that our languages get preserved. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Teresa Marshall. She's the Vice President of Globalization at Salesforce, where she is responsible for product globalization and localization. Over the past 20 years, she has held leadership positions in a number of Silicon Valley companies and has been the organizer and co-host of the annual Localization Unconference in Silicon Valley since 2009. Please welcome Teresa Marshall. Thanks for your help tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for coming. I'm going to sit down while we get ready for this. So, first of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation to the museum to have me moderate this. I am really pleased and quite happy to do that. But also, let's get started with the rest of my panel. So, I'm pleased to introduce Roy Boney Jr. Roy is an award-winning Cherokee Nation artist, filmmaker, and language revitalization activist from Oklahoma. Boney served as the Cherokee Nation language program manager for over a decade before transitioning to Cherokee Film as the Cherokee language revitalization manager. Please welcome Roy. All right, next I would like to introduce Mark Davis. Mark Davis is the Chief Technology Officer of the Unicode Consortium and the Chair of the Common Locale Data Repository Technical Committee. We'll go into what that might be. He was the president of Unicode Consortium from its incorporation in 1991 through 2022, and the chair of the board through 2023. Please welcome Mark. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Anusha Hossain. Anusha is a historian of the internet and research director of the Script Encoding Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley, where she oversees proposals for the inclusion of historic and modern minority scripts in Unicode. She's currently writing a prehistory of the Unicode standard. Please welcome Anusha. Before we get started with this conversation, I would like to share a quick video to give everybody a bit more of a background at Unicode. This footage is part of the museum's oral history program and features Mark, and also Unicode co-founder Lee Collins. Let's roll the clip, please.
Is there anything important about Unicode beyond emojis?
Well, yeah, Unicode basically enables every person on the planet to communicate. So I'd say in their own language, and I'd say that's far more important than emoji. Now, emoji is very important, no doubt about it, but just that you and I can send text or whatever, or, you know, create subtitles for a Netflix show shown in Korea, you know, that's big too. Our goal was definitely to have this flat space, equality of all languages. Joe would often say, you know, a computer should be like the phone. You don't have to have a Japanese OS phone to talk in Japanese. Any phone will communicate, will transmit data in any language. And that was kind of the vision we had.
And the challenges for linguistic inclusion.
Well, I would say the challenges now are mainly identifying who is not being included and getting enough information about their language, their writing system, to be able to add it into Unicode, and finding experts among the population of people who speak a particular language or use a particular language.
And the goal is to be able to, by supplying the right linguistic data and the right code, to be able to say, I'm going to go into my Android or iPhone and I'm going to be able to select my language, and if a program supports my language, I can at least use it for my language. I can create a spreadsheet, use a business program to produce a newsletter, to do all these sorts of things in my language. But that requires that it line break correctly, that I can see dates and times in my language, that it sorts properly, and so on.
Yeah, so encoding is the foundation of Unicode, and that's largely solved for 99% of the planet. But there's a whole ecosystem around Unicode, which is libraries to handle language, to make it easy to process, display, fonts to display it, input methods, the ability to build keyboards for any language. That's a much larger world and a much larger system of things that need to be added to. And I know the Unicode Consortium is focusing on completing that area, that much larger ecosystem, so that everybody on the planet can have their language.
Let me start with a simple question, potentially a simple question. Now that we've seen this, what would you add to this from your perspective? And this is actually for all of you. I just thought maybe I'll start with you.
Well, like for me, working with Cherokee language, they hit all the points of like Unicode for us. It's been around for about 25 years. The first few years of it, though, our community didn't understand what it was exactly until we started seeing like keyboards and fonts and seeing those on OSs. And that understanding what that means for a language, especially an endangered language, is a pretty big deal. So that the education component to get these communities to understand what Unicode is a pretty big deal.
Would you like to add something too? I know that this was done a couple of weeks ago. Do you have any
Well,
additional
as I
thoughts?
was saying earlier, I wore the same shirt so there wouldn't be any continuity errors. I think that's exactly right. What we're trying to do is make sure that every language can be handled, and that builds upon various foundations. And one of the obvious ones is you got to have the characters. But it goes beyond that, as Lee was explaining. I should add one thing is Lee's not the only other co-founder. There were a number of us, so I don't want to slight anyone.
Good. What would you like to add?
Well, maybe I'll add on to a comment that Lee made that Unicode kind of equalized languages, and it's hard to overstate what a big deal that is, and maybe it's more appropriate to say scripts instead of languages here. But we have many different types of writing systems in the world. We have ideographs, like you see for Chinese characters. You have abagitas, like Devanagari or Ethiopic, where the consonant and the vowel kind of stick together in a unit. You have alphabets, which are fairly simple. You have all of these different structures, and somehow Unicode found a way to create a common way to handle them. So that's a really big deal, I would say, and explains a lot of the innovations that were made for handling Chinese, for example, giant character sets that need to fit into a small code space. And Lee Collins was one of the people who found the way to make that work. So, it's not a given that something like Unicode would work, but it's because of a lot of these people, like Mark as well, that it does.
I'm going to see whether, maybe I'm throwing people here, but I would love to see by like a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Unicode before? Well, okay, great. I know where we are. Not surprised. How many of you do know how many modern languages are in the world? See? We might be in Silicon Valley, but we don't know that much about languages. Do you want to answer that question? How many modern languages do we know?
Modern languages, it's a little fuzzy because the line between how much usage a language is currently getting is a little fuzzy, but it's something like 7,000 languages. That's a figure that people usually use. And in terms of population number of speakers, it's a very long tail.
Yeah. And it's a bit in flux, like you said, right? I mean, we lose some languages. There's, a constant kind of evolving of languages as well, and depending on where we draw that line, it certainly changes. So let me ask you this question, and this is for Anusha and Mark. How many languages are handled by Unicode? Intentionally using those words.
Yeah, that's actually a hard question to answer. And the reason, it's very easy for us to say, or relatively easy for us to say, how many languages have all the characters in Unicode. Even that's a little bit fuzzy because if you look at the Chinese ideographs, new ones are arising all the time, or there are ones that we're finding an obscure place name that needs to be added. So it's constantly evolving. Whereas European languages, the alphabet's relatively static. But it goes, as Lee was saying, much, much further, because if you're talking about support, it's can I pick up my phone and pick my language and do things with it. Okay, can I read a web page in my language? Can I type in my language? These are all things that are at a much higher level. And then in some languages, you'll get the case where it's big enough that the operating system providers will do localization of most of their software in it. And that's sort of the very highest level. And that's probably the most costly one. And even if Teresa weren't the moderator, she could speak to that.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll add a little more on the distinction between language and script. So there are, they say, around 7,000 languages in the world, but these don't map one-to-one to script. So language is often what we think of as spoken communication. Like right now, we're speaking in the English language. But the script refers to the writing system. So English is often written in the Latin script. Kind of obvious so far. But there isn't a one-to-one mapping between these two, and that's where it gets really fuzzy, and Unicode has to do a lot of things to help make it work. So the Latin script is obviously used for English commonly, French, German, Vietnamese, North American, indigenous scripts. And conversely, you can have a language like Sanskrit written in a bunch of different writing systems. So importantly, Unicode only really fundamentally handles scripts. It has
the Unicode encoding.
Yes, Unicode encoding. It has another project called CLDR, which maybe you can talk about, that handles languages. So it's kind of a separate side project, and it's important to keep those distinct. When it comes to writing systems, my project, the Script Encoding Initiative, it actually tracks all of the writing systems in the world and how many are encoded in Unicode. If you're thinking just numbers, we have over like 300, closer to 350 writing systems in the world, and 170 of those are currently in Unicode, so we're halfway there. But of course, that doesn't map exactly onto populations. About 50% of the world uses Latin or can use Latin. So most people are being served, but if you care about digitizing archives, letting people kind of hone and nurture their own culture, then if you care about those smaller writing systems. So it's not just a population question. So I would say Unicode is doing pretty well in serving people, but there's a lot left to do.
Mark, did you want to go into a little bit of an explanation of what the CLDR is, just to sort of round out that picture of language versus script?
Sure. One of the stumbling blocks to getting this whole thing going is, as I said, there's a layer above the characters. And we had to set out to make it really easy for programmers to support things above the level of the character. One of the very important things about that are the character properties. So programmers used to say, well, if it's between A and Z, then it's a character. Okay, now we'll toss in uppercase A through Z. That clearly doesn't map to all the different languages in the world, all the different scripts. So part of what we had to do was develop properties where a programmer could say, this is a letter, and no matter which version of Unicode they're on, it will come up with the right answer. And that's key. We have somebody in the audience, Marcus Scherer, who's heading the properties and algorithms work group in Unicode, and they are devoted to maintaining all of these properties and making sure that everything works right, because if they don't work right, then your lines won't line break right. Or it'll think that something's a space when it's a letter or whatever. And there are something like 100-ish properties. It's a little bit fuzzy because some of them are provisional. So it's a lot of work to do this every year. One level above that is CLDR. And there we deal with the language-specific issues. And the goal is to make sure that we customize everything so that all the languages, all the specifics to a language work, like how the dates work, how they format, how things sort, and so on and so forth. So that's an important layer. And then above that, we produce code libraries where they can be taken into any product and used, so that people don't have to build all the code themselves that manages all of this data and properties and characters and so forth. So that's roughly the structure.
Perfect. Thank you. We're going to keep going with the language and the scripting here for a bit. So who decides whether to support a language or support a script? What is that process?
Well, why don't you talk about the writing systems first, the process
Sure.
of adding a character.
All right, it's a bad time if you have spring allergies. So at the heart, a lot of people are involved in the process, but at the heart of it is the subcommittee within Unicode called the Script Encoding Working Group. It used to be called the Script Ad Hoc. And this is a group of 15 or so experts that meet once a month, all day, and they review all of the proposals that are being submitted to Unicode for new characters, for new scripts. And it's a really interesting group of people who have some kind of linguistic background. Some of them have linguistic PhDs, or they just have a deep interest in languages. But they also have that kind of technical programming background or intuition. So they sit at this intersection, and they meet and discuss some of the stuff that Mark was talking about. How exactly does the script work? Does the proposal adequately explain all of the different characters, all of the different names, how they join together, how they line break, and is there enough evidence of use? A lot of writing systems were only invented in the last 50 years. So it's kind of harder to determine whether they're reach a certain level of legitimacy yet to be encoded in something as permanent as the Unicode standard. So this committee is kind of the first gatekeeper to it all. They see all of the proposals. The ones that they approve after some back and forth, usually 2 or 3 times with the proposal authors, get sent to a bigger Unicode group called the Unicode Technical Committee once a quarter. And then if it's approved there, then it goes into production and goes to all of the other committees like properties and algorithms and several others. There's also another organization that runs parallel to all of this called ISO. How many people know ISO? I would imagine most of you. So there's an ISO. ISO is an international organization for standardization. They have a specific working group dedicated to a universal character code. And this is synced up to Unicode So once a year, ISO meets, reviews the same proposals, and also kind of vets them and gives their approval. So all of this to say, it's a very complex, multi-stakeholder process. Do you want to add anything?
Sure. Emoji have a little bit different process. I was the first chair of the emoji subcommittee. And when it became, you can listen to the oral history if you want to hear more about that. But there we have a very different process because it's not discovering characters out in the wild and verifying that they are in use. This is new things. And so that was a very different process, and we had to develop a very different set of criteria for how we would assess emoji, whether or not it was reasonable for us to add an emoji. And the current chair of that is Jennifer Daniel. She's been doing that for about 4 or 5 years by now, and every year they have to go through a whole slew of proposals and then accept the ones that they're going to take. Now, on the language side, it's a very different process because we have developed structure. Roy, you're probably a bit familiar with this, is to be able to encompass in data how languages sort, how the date formats work, how the number formats work, currencies, a whole slew of things, units of measurement. When a unit of measurement is used for a particular thing, like road lengths versus people heights, and so on. And all of these are gathered by a tool that allows different organizations and individuals to contribute to their language. And so we have, this tool runs, we have a data submission for this, which is, right now we're in the middle of it. And so we're gathering data for new structures and letting people flesh up their language to get to a higher level of coverage. And we're aiming towards having a newer process where it makes it really easy for individuals to contribute their language. Cherokee is one of the success stories. The Cherokee Nation has done a wonderful job of supplying language data into CLDR.
We'll get to that in a little bit. And I'm almost, I don't know whether I need to be embarrassed or not to ask this question, but you brought up emojis a little bit even after the clip, so I'm going to ask you that question. I would like to ask all of you what your favorite emoji is.
I like the fire emoji.
I like that one. That's good. What about you?
I like the upside down smile and also the melting face. They're both kind of happy but troubled.
Yeah. It's funny, that came up. I asked that question to a bunch of people as I was getting ready for this in Germany, which is kind of funny. And those were the two that came up the most.
Really?
The upside down smile and the melting face. Thank you for humoring me. I'm not going to ask all of you, but if you want to chat afterwards, I'm happy to ask you to do that too. Well, let me switch gears here for a little bit. And maybe we're sort of touching into this idea of like, what challenges are out there that make it, or what challenges are there in making languages accessible online. So once we've gotten to this stage that you just sort of took us through in terms of encoding of scripts and characters and gathering the data that is in the CLDR, what else is necessary for sort of linguistic inclusion? How do we get there to this point where we're far more inclusive? Like Lee said, like how do we make this happen for more languages regardless of that background? What else is necessary?
Well, of course, it's up to people to use the tools that we provide. So if you look at phones, the phones are doing a pretty good job of picking up the CLDR data through ICU, which is the package of code that exposes it and enables it. So it's the ICU code that actually uses the collation data to to sort things. And so both Android and iPhone have done a very good job of picking these up. One of the things we want to do is extend to more languages in terms of breadth and more languages in terms of depth. And that's a way to at least get a foot in the door. So, and by a foot in the door, that means I've got a keyboard and there's a font that can handle my characters, and at least I can pull up the menu on the phone and pick my language. I typically also have to pick one of the larger languages as a fallback. And then if I open an application that supports my language, then it works. And that's a goal, is to extend that to more languages.
I'm going to guess like your point on that is going to be slightly different. Would you want to tell a little bit about sort of the story of your language, but also what you see is necessary going beyond your language, just to make language accessible and really create that language or linguistic inclusion?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. So like most indigenous languages in the United States, Cherokee is endangered. And so for like 40 years or so, the last 40 years, our community has been trying to find ways to preserve it and revitalize it. And there have been people just on their own making their own fonts, back like in the 80s and 90s. And these fonts they were like, everyone had to have the same font on their machines. If they didn't, they couldn't communicate. And so when Unicode, encoded the Cherokee syllabary, that technology, like I mentioned earlier in our community, not a lot of people understood what that meant. So we had this situation where these fonts that had been developed before that were not Unicode, people were really kind of like sentimental with them. They really want to keep using them. So trying to get them to shift from that to what Unicode is, because Unicode is a much better way to do things. But that educational component of getting the community to understand what these tools are and what they can do, that was a big challenge we had to overcome. And like for us, the first time that we kind of figured out what Unicode was, it was in the Mac OS. In OS 10, I think it was 10.3, I forget, well, whatever it was at the time, but that had the keyboard and a Cherokee font in it. And so our tribe operates a language immersion school. And at the time, the kids didn't have any computers that would work in their language. So we were trying to find all these solutions. And then I've always been a big Apple user. And so just playing around with the settings, like you mentioned, you see the settings in there. There's a Cherokee component. You're like, well, what is this? And that's kind of what clued me into, well, there's this keyboard and font built in the Mac OS. How come we're not using this? And that kind of went down the rabbit hole to explaining to our community why this was different from what happened before. And that took just a couple of years really for everyone to understand that. So getting the educational component of what it is, and then making sure, like you mentioned earlier, the font and keyboard is very essential, and having an OS or a system that's going to support it too, that's accessible to your community. So as we discovered that, we started working with all these companies out here in Silicon Valley to make sure they all supported our language. So establishing those relationships too to ensure these vendors are supporting this is a big component as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's probably at least another half of the battle, I would assume. So Anusha, let me ask you, how long does it typically take to encode a script? Whether you want to tell a story of an existing script or something new that you're working on, how long does that take?
The short answer is that it takes a long time. So the script encoding initiative, the project that I work on, it's an independent organization, but it works really closely with Unicode, and its job is to kind of be the friendly face along this process. So we work with a lot of communities, scholars who want to use historic scripts in their publications, or modern minority script communities to propose their writing systems into Unicode. And we actually did a research project to see exactly what the stats are, how long it takes. And on average, it's about 2 or 3 proposals, and that amounts to about 2 or 3 years of just getting it into Unicode. And then there are all the other parts of fonts and language data and keyboards and operating system level support. But it can range a lot. In the early days, it went really fast. Sometimes something would take just a few months in one proposal. And conversely, if something is super controversial, it can take up to 10 years. So Old Hungarian is one example that had like 13 proposals or something like that, and lots of back and forth. And that's often not because of a Unicode issue, it's because of a social or political issue. If there are different groups that disagree exactly on what the writing system looks like, sometimes it's a matter of like 2 or 3 characters. There's a script called Paleo-Hispanic that the scholars couldn't agree exactly on what the character repertoire should be, and it was a matter of exactly 2 or 3 characters, and so that kind of stalls the process. So it's kind of this interdisciplinary work where you have to sort out all of these human issues at the same time as sorting out the technical stuff. But we make sure to tell people that you're kind of in it for the long haul. It's a big time investment up front, but then if it's done right, then it's in Unicode forever.
So apart from these 2 organizations or these initiatives and Unicode working together, who do you have to work with to get this through? So you mentioned sort of the community of the language or the script. What other groups do you work with to get a script encoded in that sense?
I mean, maybe Roy can answer that well, but often for us it's with the scripts community and with scholars if they're publishing with it, for example.
Did you work directly with Unicode to get Cherokee?
Yeah, well, there were 2 processes to the Cherokee encoding. The first was, I didn't have anything to do with the initial one. That was like in the 1999, 2000 or so when that happened. But several years ago, we did a proposal to add casing to Cherokee. So we wanted the lowercase Cherokee in it. And so we worked with Michael Everson. I think a lot of people know him. He helped develop a font for that too, and he worked with our language team to essentially decide what this might look like, because as you know, lowercase sometimes looks much different than the uppercase. We opted basically just for a smaller version, but again, working with these scholars, these translators and font designers and just historians of the language, it took a big team of people to get this done. And then getting the proposal going through the process, there's a lot of revisions, and so there's quite a lot of research that goes into it. And it was really helpful to have the community members involved in that.
I think that's probably key from stories I've heard. I think some of the bigger companies also have outreach program managers who do that. One story that I've heard was Indigenous languages in New Zealand and Australia, and it was very much that, where actually both of your examples, it took an entire community, obviously, and specialists everywhere, but also it came down to a few items where that language community couldn't agree, which then produced a long proposal process or long.
Yeah, one thing there occasionally there are characters we have to fast track. For example, when a Japanese emperor dies, then it's a new era, and the era character is used in dates. So all of a sudden we have to fast track this character and make sure it goes through all the process and gets out as soon as possible. That happens with characters like that, currency symbols, or various other things where we have to really have an expedited process for getting the characters in. We also, I should say, there's a very large international organization called the IRG that we work closely with ISO in order to add to Chinese ideographs. And Chinese ideographs are the largest part of Unicode. They outnumber all other characters completely. And we have a series of tranches that come out, and I think we're up to G or H, something like that, in terms of these very, very large sets. And those have a completely different process that take a lot of work, because part of the problem with Unicode is making sure what a character is. It seems simple, But when you're looking at a huge character set where there are lots of variations, you have to think, well, is this really a different character, or is it the same character with a different representation? A character in Arial looks very different than a character in italic Garamond, for example, but it's the same character. And so with Chinese, you've got this massive problem of making sure that when you want to add a new thing, it's not already there.
That's great. As you heard, I work in localization. I work convincing most of the time my company that we have to do this and why, and that it's the right thing to do. Storytelling, like what Mark just sort of went through, is the #1 thing that will actually get a lot of my peers and a lot of upper management to agree, because that's really where you can create, through those stories, you can create inclusion. I also remember the new whatever it's called, when the emperor in Japan passed away, and that actually did create just quite some fire drills on our side as well. We were talking about language inclusion, and we were talking about communities that we or you needed in order to really sort of work on making the languages and the encoding, the writing system accessible. Can you maybe go through a little bit more what effects it has when a language is accessible online, or when it's included in the ability to display it or work in that language on a computer or on your phone? What does that do for a community?
Yeah, it's a major, you kind of take it for granted, like if your language is supported on all these devices, but when it's not, you realize quickly how limited you are in what you're trying to do and when you're trying to communicate. Even if you're trying, a good example is the Cherokee Nation has a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, and it's been around since the 1820s. But when it got to the digital age, there was a lot of issues trying to publish it in Cherokee language. Because the original paper was bilingual, it was in English and Cherokee, but they were using printing presses. And so when we got to the modern era, when you got to the old desktop publishing, that font issue came up again. So people made these custom fonts, which were essentially just English fonts with Cherokee glyphs mapped on top of it. And so that caused a lot of issues when you try to go to print. If you went to a print shop to make an issue with the paper, there's all these things would arise. So once it got standardized through this encoding, it really helps with that communication aspect, and even things like for production like that. And then with the Cherokee Nation engaging in language revitalization, it helped us develop materials in the language much easier that we could actually share with our community. And it's ever since it took a bit for our community to understand what it was really. And then once we figured that, we had that aha moment, that's when we decided like, hey, well, if it can work in Mac OS, how come it can't work in the iPhone? And then we started that communication chain trying to get all these devices and OSs to support the language, and that kind of snowballed. And now, when you see the ability of a Cherokee elder to text their child or grandchild in the language, it's a pretty major moment. I remember when that first happened with the iPhone that came out, they added Cherokee support, and I guess it was, I forget, several years ago now, but seeing, I used to work for some translators there, and they would text, each other, and just to see their face, like, kind of like, wow, our language is in this device. It was amazing to watch. Now, several years into it, it's become common for our community to have this access. More and more people are making their own content. You see it all over social media. There's quite a lot of people that have their usernames in the syllabary, which is, it's a big deal. I mean, it may seem like a small thing just to be able to do that, but having that visibility for a native language in such a platform is huge. And then we're moving into a new era now. We're doing film and TV dubbing. And part of that process requires us to have, the words on the screen for our actors, and using software that allows us to, throw that on the screen as the actors are trying to dub that content on the screen. This is something we could never imagine years ago. So this access, it gives you confidence to do things you never thought you could do in your language. And So when you go from not having that support to suddenly having it, whatever dreams you have, you can actually pursue those with your language. So we're really grateful for Unicode and encoding our language into that. And so it's been a major boon for us, for our language, the revitalization programs that the tribe has.
That's great. It's such a success story that I'm almost embarrassed to ask. The next question as well, because it might take it into a different direction. Do you think a language that isn't encoded, that doesn't have this kind of support and isn't handled as inclusively, has a chance to survive?
I think it could survive like in spoken form, but if you want to do all the written communication, that's where the big thing is. But having said that, I mean, if your language isn't written, you don't have a written form, it's kind of hard to keep it going. So it is a challenge if a language is not encoded. I think you would have a really hard time of being sure in its survival.
One more reason why it's so important.
What's that?
Is that one more reason why it's so important? So I think quite often when we think about Unicode, people who don't live and breathe scripts and CLDR and all this kind of work and language accessibility and inclusivity, there's sort of this myth out there that Unicode's been around for a while, that the work is done. What would you say to that?
I remember my boss at Apple asking me that in about 98. And there are a lot of languages, most languages, or most people on the planet, their characters are in Unicode already. So that's thanks to the efforts of the script encoding group. So if you just look at it in sheer population, it's a small population, but there are still a lot of historical works. I mean, we want to preserve the history of the world, and that means being able to have the digital representation for works going back centuries. Those are actually quite difficult. If you look at hieroglyphics, it's thousands of years span, and I talked about the difficulty with Chinese characters of figuring out whether this is just a new character or whether it's a variant of another one. With scripts like hieroglyphics, it's a massive issue. There's a Mayan project that's being worked on and so on. So the historical stuff is important, but as far as the language support goes, we have pretty full support for about 100 languages, and then it trails off pretty quickly. So there are a lot of languages that don't have the language support in Unicode CLDR that lets them get on at a level that, say, Cherokee is at. And so I think that language support is vital. And the requirements are always advancing. People are finding things that they want to do on computers, and we have to adapt to that, and we have to support them. So there are a lot of new initiatives that we're working on in order to get that further along and to meet the product requirements so that people don't just code for English or for Western Europe, because they don't have the capability to do something that they should be able to.
Nisha, do you want to add something to that?
I think you put it well. There's just there's a long to-do list of scripts that we already know of to add, and more are being invented, and maybe we will want to add them. So there's that part, and then of course just maintaining what's already there. People file bugs. Arabic is technically in Unicode, but it still doesn't work great. And that's not just a Unicode problem, but...
Not say Mongolian.
We won't say Mongolian. But there's a lot to do just to make what's already in there functional for people. And if there's even a little bit of friction, it's so easy to switch into the Latin script. because that's there and that's functional, or to come up with a hack, like where I was talking about hacked fonts that Cherokee Nation used, but many people use, even if something's in Unicode, if it's not supported throughout the whole tech stack, people will just come up with other ways to make things show up correctly. But the huge issue with that is that that text is not kind of processed correctly by search engines, by anything on the internet. So you're kind of opting out of this whole global communication paradigm that we have. So it's very high stakes to make it all work exactly right.
Well, I can ask you the same question, but slightly differently. So once you have the encoding for Cherokee, you have the language support. From your point of view, what work remains for that?
I think I've mentioned it before. It's this educational component. I know, like this crowd here probably understands what it is much better than the average everyday person that's using and texting on their phone. And if you don't understand the importance of why having something encoded like that, like with your language support, is vital, because like she said, you opt out of a lot of things, especially in this technological world. So for me, I still engage in this quite a lot, because we have people that are making materials in Cherokee language, and still, there's still people that try to use that old font that's not Unicode in Cherokee, and it's so hard to break that habit. But it's not because they're like anti-Unicode; they just don't know what it is, So I've spent a lot of time sitting with people and explaining to them why you need to use this keyboard and this font or whatever. It's not trying to prescribe something that they have to do because that's the only way, but it is making this communication better for everyone. So I think having more public events where people can understand and how to use Unicode, I guess. I mean, to make it understandable for the general public. Because I know the work that like you do is very important in terms of getting the encoding in and these committees and all this. But the person out there, the end user, they don't need to know all that particular process, but they do need to know that's important to utilize that tool that's out there. If it's if their language is encoded, to be sure to use it, to keep it going too. And if anything advances, they can participate in all the new tech out there.
I sort of threw it out with the question about it's done, but what do you think might change? What are the biggest challenges for linguistic inclusion? And that's for all of you, whether it's from your perspective of Unicode or the initiative of your language community. What do you think are the challenges that we're going to be facing in the realm of linguistic inclusion going forward?
Well, I can think of two things. One is the Unicode consortium itself is relatively small. We have some companies that are very active and support Unicode, but we always have way more work to do than we have people. And so it's important to get people engaged. It's important to get companies to get involved and support the work. On the other side, there's a lot of education to do just to make people aware of what they can do with what we have, as you were talking about. And especially if we're talking about indigenous communities or smaller communities who don't necessarily have the resources to know how to deal with this stuff, that's an area that could really be important for people to contribute to. And that's kind of outside of our scope, but there are a lot of NGOs that are involved in that area.
Anusha, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to say, it feels like this whole space is kind of a tragedy of the commons. Like everyone benefits from the shared standards and data sets and software libraries that Unicode produces. And it's easy to kind of take that for granted. And I mean, the term is to free ride, like to use it, but it takes something more to get all the stakeholders to also keep investing in it. And I think right now it's the challenge is to make that case that the project isn't done. I think because most people are served by the majority scripts, it's easy to feel like that. So we all have to kind of figure out what stories to tell. And because it's so niche and kind of difficult to describe the work, I think we haven't succeeded in that yet, but I think that's the challenge.
With that, I'm going to move over to sort of your participation in this forum and look at the questions that I received during this. I do agree that, really sort of highlighting that whether you work in localization, whether you work on the globalization and the engineering side, we see that all the time, right? So I think this is where everybody can contribute in the sense as well. It's like how do we tell those stories, the different layers? How can we simplify why it is so important? And I think actually your story is a great story for others to not to retell your story, but to highlight as another point in terms of inclusivity. So with that, I'm going to see what questions I have here. What do you wish, let me start with this, what do you wish the average garden variety typeface creator knew about language encoding?
Say that again?
What do you wish the average typeface creator knew about language encoding?
I have my own pet peeves. The interesting thing is with complex scripts. Latin is a relatively simple script. There are a lot of scripts that are relatively simple. There's just one character after another, roughly. And when we talk about more complex scripts, we get bidirectional scripts like Arabic or Hebrew, where it goes in two directions. And that's an area where it has traditionally been difficult to get the right tools to programmers to make sure that they could handle that. I remember at Google, we had a 40 language initiative, and a whole slew of products got up to 38 because the last two were Arabic and Hebrew. And then it took them a while to get up through Arabic and Hebrew. And there are other scripts like the scripts of India, which can be quite complex, and you get characters. If you type two characters, then it'll change, and part of one character will hop over another one and appear on the other side, and so forth. So the typographers designing fonts really have to take into account the characteristics of the scripts that they're dealing with, and a lot of features that are fairly subtle, like the shape of a semicolon can vary depending upon which script they're dealing with. And there are mechanisms in fonts to deal with this. The font can actually look at the language that it's asked to display and can do something different. It can make the grave accent in one language look slightly different than the grave accent does in another language. So for typographers, I think part of the issue is make sure to know the scripts you're dealing with, and also to look at the other characters that people commonly use or commonly see, including various punctuation, to make sure that they are aligned with the characters of the script, and that the script will look okay when it's next to Latin, because Latin is typically used immersed in a lot of text in a lot of languages that don't use Latin as their script.
Okay. I'm going, by the way, by your vote, so I'm not making these up on my own. Excuse me. In terms of understanding user behavior or character usage, how involved are major platform developers like Apple and Google?
That's a little hard to ask in terms of characters. I mean, a lot of it depends upon having the characters in Unicode in order to figure out what to do with them. Okay, what are the most common characters used in particular languages? How to do, for example, language detection. I see an old colleague, Dick, over there was working heavily on that, and language detection is extremely important. And so you can take the 6,000-ish languages that use Latin, and you want to try to distinguish which language they're in because you want to, say, search differently depending upon what language the query is in or a page is in. And you find out that a lot of web pages are not tagged with the language, so you have to kind of figure out what it is. So a lot of what goes into it, the encoding is there, but there's a lot of mechanism on top of that to really take advantage of the characters and how they deal, the role that they play in different languages. Does that help?
I'm hoping it does. If
I guess I should ask the audience.
Exactly. If not, somebody can, raise their hand or start yelling. Please don't start yelling. So here's one that I think is really not surprising given the audience, but I actually don't know the answer to it, even though I probably should. So does Unicode encode any fictional languages or character sets, such as the ones Tolkien's created for Lord of the Rings?
That's a good question. We have, over the years, very regularly gotten requests for clean-on. Okay. And we have no policy decision against artificial languages. They have to be in widespread use, but there's no policy decision. But we're not going to encode something when the person who has the intellectual property rights, or the company in this case, doesn't release them so that we can put them into Unicode. So if you want clean-on in Unicode, then you need to get Paramount to say that it's cool.
That's a great answer to the question I asked earlier in terms of how many different groups does it take to actually get something encoded. This one is interesting as well, not that the other ones aren't. How do you balance the decisions about encoding historic scripts versus scripts of currently endangered languages?
Yeah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. In some sense, historic scripts are easier because they're more stable. But even that can be not true if new stone slabs are being discovered and changing the decipherment, which happens occasionally. But I think the issue with modern scripts is that they're still kind of alive in a more real way than other scripts. There's one of the big examples that people like to talk about is the Adlam script from West Africa, and that was invented only in the 90s. And it took about 15, 20 years for it to make its way into Unicode, and it's now available in fonts and keyboards and operating systems. And it's this great example of a script that kind of took its time and eventually got added. But even that script is still going through revisions, and we've had some back and forth again. Changing certain parts of Unicode cannot be changed, but certain things can, like annotations and glyphs. So I think there's a wariness around the newer scripts just because you're trying to guess what will stick and what won't. And one of the principles in Unicode is that once something's in there, it can't be changed. It's the absoluteness guarantee. And this is what makes sure that any software that builds on top of it can rely on Unicode. It's an important guarantee. So that's why modern scripts are trickier.
I think we're going to have to find at least one question about an emoji. It's also one that is on top of my list in terms of your vote, so thank you for helping me out in doing that. Non-standard emojis are growing in popularity. They're either user created or AI created, or they're sent as JPEGs, but they're just certainly growing in popularity. How might the role of Unicode change as breadth of digital expressions widens?
I think I might have to tell a little bit of history. Emoji originated in Japan. Most people know that. We were first approached in something like 2000 about putting emoji into Unicode. And we said, well, this is not in scope. We don't encode these colorful little things. We're targeting language. But then around 2006, there was a lot of pressure to extend Unicode to cover all the needs of Japan, including emoji, which were encoded as characters. So in order to deal with the different vendors in Japan, you would have to put the characters into Unicode and treat them as text. And so Google approached, this was my Google hat on, Google approached Unicode and said, we really need to encode these things to make sure they would work for Japan. And so taking my Google hat off, we ended up approving this expansion of scope and deciding that we would go ahead and encode the Japanese characters. And at first, these were only available in Japan, but it proved to be quite popular around the world. And so we ended up getting a lot of pressure to fill in the gaps. There were lots of idiosyncrasies with the sets that we got from Japan, including lack of diversity in terms of gender, in terms of skin tone, that we wanted to address. And we ended up growing the set and adding regularly some small number. But we had always kept in mind that once the technology is there to really distribute safely images embedded within text, there's not much need for emoji. So we're never particularly attached to that. The only real advantage of emoji over just putting a little image in is that the image can't go into like a file name. It can't go into a lot of places that a character can go in. And it can't be searched for in the same way. But even those things eventually, as the text structure becomes richer and embedded images are reliably transported across the whole stream, then emoji will then become unnecessary because everyone will be able to have their own. And we don't, that's fine. Not a problem.
All right. Here's an interesting one. What was one of the most interesting human conflicts over a script?
Oh, there were a lot. Let me see. Tamil and Japanese and Cambodian and Turkish. Those were the ones.
You don't want to share anymore.
It was Japanese had a lot of difficulty early on with emoji, and part of the reason was that we we took all of the ideographs that were based on Chinese ideographs and decided to unify them. Now, the unification process was very, we came up with a process working with IRG to look at different levels of changes between characters and encoded, and we had this 3-axis system that allowed us to say that, well, 2 of these axes we would go ahead and code as characters, but things that varied along what was called the z-axis, we wouldn't, because we would view those as font variations. And a lot of that was actually based upon the principles that the Japanese themselves used to say when 2 ideographs were identical or not. But when we came out with Unicode, a lot of people were concerned because they wanted to say, what happens if I send a message to a friend? Is it going to show up in a Chinese font and then look wrong? And so a lot of that, there was a lot of resistance initially, but there were a lot of advantages to having Unicode as well. And as long as you've got a text superstructure that lets you display things with a font, it's not a problem. Or as long as you are exchanging text, in Japanese with Japanese, and it's going to go in a Japanese newspaper, it's going to be read by a Japanese using a Japanese browser that's going to have Japanese fonts, then everything works fine. But there are still odd cases where somebody displays some characters, they're not familiar with Japanese or Chinese, and the characters display for Japan display in characters that would, in a representation that would be more like China, and that's embarrassing. Luckily, most display products really let you set the font and control that. But that was a big issue for a number of years. There were a lot of articles in Japanese written about how bad Unicode was. So I think that was probably the biggest one. Yeah.
Do you have an interesting one that you sort of sticks in your mind?
Yeah, well, it's funny you ask. I wrote my dissertation about just one character that spurred years of debate. There's so much to say about it. It's the Bengali letter kondatta. I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
This is in the early 2000s, but it really stands in for the whole class of Indic scripts. And one of the policy decisions that Unicode made when it started was that it wanted to go for completeness. It takes a long time, as we've been saying, to add standards. So when it launched, it incorporated many existing standards that were out there in the world. So you had ASCII, but you also had ISCII, which was the Indian national standard. And ISCII tried to handle 9 of the major writing systems from the subcontinent all in one go. And Unicode kind of just took it and put it in at the time with some vetting, but perhaps not enough. And there were just endless issues for years. I kind of read about it in the archives, but you probably lived it, Mark. I see your name in the archives a lot.
Yeah.
But Tamil was a big one, Bengali, kondatta, it was like one letter that the argument was whether it could be handled in a font or not. And it just spurred like incredible debate, like Unicode people, linguists, national ministries, regular people, everyone was chiming in, doing their own kind of linguistic, historical research, technical analyses, and chiming in. And Unicode did eventually encode it. And in my kind of analysis of the situation, I would say it was like the first big challenge to ISCII within Unicode. There were other cases that happened over time, including Tamil, that kind of taught Unicode people, in my view, that ISCII or some of the things that they'd already put in were not that great and needed to evolve. So, I'm a historian, and what I think is so remarkable about Unicode is that in some ways it is this permanent edifice, but it's really interesting how it changes over time, and that's because the people who are in it are changing their minds. It's this open process where outside perspectives come in, there's dialogue, and then there's kind of an evolution. Does that match your experience?
Yeah, it's what we set out to do when we started was make sure that we encompassed all the major encoding systems in the world, so that you could say we could take data that you wrote in ISCII, in Tamil, and translate it into Unicode and not lose it. And so ISCII, the Indian government was very strongly in favor of ISCII, and we decided we would just follow that model and encode the characters, and we've had to make adjustments since then. Adjustments meaning new characters, or in some cases, a reinterpretation of the properties of characters.
I'm going to apologize. We're not going to get to all your questions, obviously, but I found one that I thought was a nice way to sort of round this up, and I hope you don't mind me asking. Here's a question. It says, Roy, what was the first phrase in Cherokee that you wrote in Unicode?
It was Osio Elohi, which is hello world.
That's
Nice
great.
coding joke there. So.
Yeah, that's great. Let me thank you, all of you, the panelists, for joining us today. And let me thank you for your attention and for showing up. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up.
Thank you.